Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Megan Rodriguez with The Resident Life. We're excited to have this presentation today. Perfect timing to talk about welcoming spring, as the first day of spring just happened, and we're starting to get nicer weather and enjoying the outside time. So we're very excited to have our speaker today, Mike Dunn, here. He is well versed in all things nature, has had a career in many different parts of nature and connected to that. And in fact, a lot of our emails and stuff, he would email me back and say, sorry, it took me a while. I was in the swamp today. So he's very much still in nature and observing and learning and loves to share that. So he'll talk a little bit more about himself in a second. But before that, just want to say a few housekeeping items. If you can, keep your microphones muted while he is speaking, and then at the end, we'll have a time for question and answer. You can either type your questions throughout his presentation in the chat box, or you can use the little raise hand button through Zoom to indicate that you have a question. And at the end, I'll go through those and read them out, and you can unmute yourself at that point if you want to ask something else. The other thing is we are recording this to show later next week on channel 1391. So if you don't want your video on to possibly be seen, you can turn that off now. Looks like everyone has it off right now. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mike, and he's going to share his screen at some point for some PowerPoint slides. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here today. You're right. It's absolutely gorgeous today. It started out a little questionable, but the temperatures are warming, and I'm seeing bees and butterflies flitting around. So I think this is a great topic for this time of year. And just to give you a little more background, I have given at least one talk, I know, at your facility, maybe two. And I retired from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences back in 2013, I guess, after spending 24 years with them as a mainly teacher education is what I did. So I would go to schools across the state and help teachers feel comfortable taking their kids out on the school grounds and planting native plants to attract butterflies and birds and that sort of thing. And then the other half of my job was taking educators, teachers and informal educators like park rangers, to incredible natural areas, both in North Carolina and beyond, and just getting them excited about the natural world to come back and share it with their students or their audience. And so I had the best job in state government, I will say. I've been able to travel to some amazing places. Yellowstone has been one of my favorite destinations, and I've been there now about 47 times, I think. So I've been very lucky. And so now I live in Chatham County. We have about 14 acres of hardwoods, and we have a lot of native plants planted around the house, and you're going to be seeing a lot of the spring things in my yard and property. So that's kind of where I am. I also worked at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. After I retired the first time, I went back to work for a while and then re-retired last year, ready to travel. And then this funny thing called a pandemic happened. So we were able to do a little traveling, but not as much as I'd hoped. So, we're fortunate to live where we do in such a beautiful place. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get the program started here. Okay. I think spring, everybody probably has a favorite season. Mine is spring because of the amazing changes that happen. I mean, I love winter, I will say, unlike a lot of people, but I just love watching the transformation that happens in the spring of the year. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Things that you can observe maybe around your facilities there, or if you go for a hike somewhere in a nearby park or natural area. So, all right. The thing about spring, you know, this has been an interesting year. Been an extremely wet year. We didn't get much snow, but it's been cooler than some recent springs, but doesn't matter because, as this quote says, plants recognize spring and are ready for it. This is a dogwood blossom bud encased in ice from a few years ago. Right now, the buds on this flower in my yard are forming. This is a wild columbine. And Thoreau, I love using quotes because other people can say things so much better than I. He also had a quote about the reason he went to live at Walden Pond was to experience spring happening. He had the time to watch spring occur. And so I feel fortunate to live in the woods myself and am able to do that. I think one of the greatest things about spring is that subtle change from bare limbs to this incredibly light green aura that just shines throughout the woodlands. Again, I live mainly in a hardwood forest, so it's pretty dramatic. You know, we don't have that many evergreens except for hollies. And so this light green color of spring is definitely one of my favorite things. Spring is a northward moving phenomenon. I think Edward Way Teal wrote a book, North with Spring, and calculated that it moves north at about 15 miles per day. And if you're in a mountainous area, it moves up a mountain at about 100 feet per day. So it's something, I love living in North Carolina because with the spring wildflowers that happen, if I miss them here in the Piedmont, I know that in a few weeks I can drive to the mountains and see them there because spring is arriving later at the higher elevations. And boy, if you lived in a place like Asheville, you could experience spring very easily for several weeks longer than any of us by just driving up to higher elevations. Spring has also, the study of spring has become an important scientific thing with climate change being such a concern now. And there's a term called phenology, which is nature's calendar. And there's a lot of people that are studying it and examining things like when plants bloom, when birds arrive or insects start showing up for the first time, or leaf out. And that's a phenomenon that I did a few years ago, or watched a few years ago, because I was helping some teachers with a thing called Project Budburst, where you actually monitor the rate of leaf out of certain species and record it. And so this is a picture, a series of photos I took. I marked individual twigs and went out and photographed them over time. And so I was thinking when I first went back and looked at this picture that, wow, we're a little behind schedule this year. But actually, I don't think we are. March 28th, you see that dogwood flower starting to open just about. And I went out and looked at my dogwood tree today, and it's not quite that big yet in opening, but it has opened a little bit. So we're about on schedule. And my woods, I tried to think of a name for our property, and I was going to call it Buckeye Bottoms, but people said, no, that doesn't sound too good. So we're covered in painted buckeye, a shrub, a native shrub. And I just love watching this. It's phenomenal. If you've never, it's sort of like watching paint dry, some might think, but if you look at a terminal bud on a plant, especially say in January, and then you start looking at it again in late February, it's amazing the change. So here's a series of photos of painted buckeye, the same twig, over time, starting in March, and it's already starting to swell on March 10th. March 17th, you see the sepals open up a little bit, the bud scales, and then the leaves start coming out. And these are 1-inch squares that I would put behind the twig to photograph it. And look at the incredible difference in just a week's time. And right now, we're actually a little ahead of this schedule now, because almost all of the painted buckeye this year have already fully leafed out and do have the flower stalks. So it's kind of mind-boggling that all that material is stored within that bud and can grow so quickly. The other thing I love about watching buds on plants is just their intricate beauty. Here's that same buckeye bud, but closer up, and looking at the detail and the sculptural qualities of it, the architectural qualities. It's really amazing over time, and the delicate nature of it, and then just the patterns are phenomenal. I particularly like tree buds when they're opening up. They look prayerful perhaps in some cases, but they certainly are always elegant. So here's a terminal bud of a mockernut hickory, and then a tulip poplar is one of my favorites, the way it kind of unfolds like this and then opens up. Bitternut hickory, we have a few of those, and they're one of the few plants that has a yellowish or gold terminal bud like this, and it looks like two hands together to me. And then pawpaw, which we have a lot of, it's called a naked bud. There's not much there except a little fuzzy thing. But in addition to the trees budding out, the first flowers of spring are something I think that a lot of people look forward to. When I worked at the botanical garden, people would flock to the gardens about this time of year to see all the spring flowers that are so delicate usually. And a lot of these are so-called spring ephemerals, which means they are relatively short-lived, and they bloom before the deciduous trees leaf out and block the sunlight. So here is an hepatica, and you notice how fuzzy the stem and the sepals are, and that's believed to be a thermoregulatory adaptation to help protect the bud in cold weather. It's also believed to be an anti-ant adaptation, so that ants don't tend to steal the pollen out of the plant. And here's one open. And right now, the first one, this picture was taken on January 27th this year, which is really early for hepatica to bloom. But I still have a couple down in the woods blooming. So they apparently are fairly deer resistant. We have a huge deer population in our community. And unfortunately, a lot of the wildflowers have been nibbled except inside our deer fence. One of my favorites is Bloodroot, and it'll pop up. A couple of years ago in March, we had a snowstorm, and the Bloodroots were still popping up through the snow. But as you can see in the other picture, the flower bud emerges and is actually wrapped by the single leaf, which helps protect it from the cold, and then it will open up. Bloodroot is a beautiful wildflower. I have a couple of clusters of them in my yard, and an important early nectar source for a lot of things. And you see the scientific name there, sanguinaria, and sanguis in Latin means blood. And the reason it's named that is every part of the plant, except perhaps the flower, if you tear it or cut it, it looks like it's bleeding. It has a red compound in it that actually has some medicinal properties and some toxic properties. Often in nature, in the plant world, if something is somewhat toxic, it can also be used medicinally if used properly. So here is a bloodroot root that I exposed and just gently cut with a knife blade, and you see the red coloration there. And then I tore a leaf, and it literally looks like drops of blood coming out of the leaf. So there's in fact, my grandmother, I remember as a kid going to visit her, and she lived in the mountains of Virginia, and she had a bandage around her leg one year where she had cut herself while picking blackberries, and the bandage was looked like it was soaked in blood, but it was actually soaked in bloodroot juice as a tonic, a poultice. So that was my first introduction to medicinal properties of bloodroot. But it has another fascinating story that is similar to many other spring wildflowers. In the seed pod there, it splits open, and then the seed, which is this shiny brown thing, falls out. But this seed has this weird glob attached to it. It's called an eliasome, and it's actually a lipid and protein glob. And the purpose of that is that it is an attractant to ants. And this weird word, myrmecochory, is defined as seed dispersal by ants. So over half of our woodland spring wildflowers here in the Piedmont their seeds have these elaiosomes, and they are dispersed then by ants. When the seed falls to the ground, ants are attracted to it. They pick it up, they carry the seed back to their nest and eat the elaisome and dispose of the seed. So basically what that does is it protects the seed from being eaten by rodents and stuff, and it gets the seed into the trash pile of the ant nest, which is generally a good place for germination. So it's an amazing adaptation. When I first found out about this, I collected some seeds of a trillium in my yard and put them on a piece of paper, and I was going to photograph them. So I went inside to get my camera, and by the time I came back out, all the seeds were gone. So it happens pretty quickly sometimes. A couple of years ago at the botanical garden, one of the staff called me and said, "Mike, there's these ants all over the trilliums. Come here and look." And I went over, and the seed pod had split open a little bit, and ants had gone inside and were just working madly trying to cut out the individual seeds. And, you know, one by one, then they would haul the seed off. And it was about 10 feet to their nest from that location. And the elizome, in addition to providing a food source, it acts, you can see it'd be hard for an ant to grab onto the hard, round, shiny seed. So it's like a handle for the seed as well. So it's an amazing thing to witness if you ever are fortunate enough to see one before the ants actually take them all away. It only took, I think, about 2 hours for the ants to totally empty these seed pods on that trillium. Another of my favorite spring wildflowers that's blooming right now in my yard are the trout lilies. And they're only, you know, I guess they're about yay tall. Beautiful dappled leaves. That's how they got their name. The leaves look like trout skin, so they're called trout lilies, also called fawn lilies for being spotted like a fawn. And in my yard, if they have 2 leaves, they're going to produce a flower. And that flower comes up between the 2 leaves, again, to protect it from the cold. And they'll only bloom for probably a week and a half or so. If they only have 1 leaf, it's not going to flower or produce a flower. And it may take anywhere up to 7 years for that plant to actually mature enough to produce a flower. So I've got a big patch of single leaf trout lilies. And they've been there 2 years so far and haven't produced a flower yet. I'm guessing it's where some ants, there was an ant nest there, and they carried the seeds, because this plant also has its seeds dispersed. And it's one of the more delicate flowers I love to look at. It's got 3 petals. And then if you look at it from above, it has 3 sepals. The sepals are the things that actually enclose the bud and protect it. But from beneath, the sepals look just like the petals, and it has a special term called tepals. So that's your botanical nomenclature lesson for today. And as I mentioned, after the flower has been pollinated, the stem drops down to the ground with the seed pod on it, and then in a week or so later, it'll split open and ants will disperse the seeds. One of the plants that is well known in spring and so named Spring Beauty. I saw my first one blooming 2 weeks ago. I have patches of them in the yard, and they're very common along the Haw River, which is near our property. They're an interesting plant to look at closely. They're delicate, only a few inches tall, and with sort of grass-like leaves. And they have an interesting flowering timetable. A lot of plants do this. On the first day that the flower opens, the male parts of the flower, the stamens, are upright, and you notice they have pink pollen. It's kind of unusual. And then overnight, the stamens kind of drop off to the side, and these flowers typically close up at night, by the way, on cloudy days. And so overnight, the stamens drop by the side, and the next day when the flowers open, the female part of the plant, the pistil, which is a 3-part stigma, rises up and is receptive to pollen. So as a bee visits a male flower, picks up pollen, if it goes and visits a 2-day-old flower, female, it can transfer that more readily to the plant and pollinate it. And it turns out there's a specialist pollinator for spring beauties called, interestingly enough, the spring beauty bee. It's a tiny native bee, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. You know, honeybees get all the promo. They have a good advertising firm working for them. But our native bees, and North Carolina has about 500 species of native bees, they are critically important for a lot of our wild plants and actually crop plants as well. And the spring beauty bee is particularly interesting because of this pink pollen. And here's a photo of a spring beauty bee that could barely fly, because look at its legs. It's like it has, you know, pink overalls on. It's just packed with pink pollen. So it's a fascinating interrelationship. And that's about the only plant that spring beauty bees will visit. Another interesting point about that plant is it's an important food. And if you dig one up, which I always hesitate to do, but I dug one up in my yard for this to show you, the corm, or the little bulb, is actually edible. It tastes like potatoes. So a lot of wildlife, especially in the mountains, bears will dig up spring beauties because they typically occur in patches, so they can dig them up. Even though they're tiny, they can munch on these things for several hours. In our woods, this is probably the most common spring wildflower, cutleaf toothwort. I'm guessing it's somewhat resistant to browsing by deer. That's why I have so many of them. It's an interesting little flower. It's in the mustard family, and you can see why it's called cutleaf. It looks like somebody took scissors and cut out the leaves, and then the toothwort has to do with the edges of the leaves, but it also has to do with the shape of the root. The scientific name is concatenata, the species name, and that word means linked in a series. So it looks like a series of teeth linked together. The actual root itself looks a little bit like a tooth. So a lot of plants, when they're like milkwort, toothwort, the word wart, W-O-R-T, is Old English for plant. So this actually means tooth plant. And one of the reasons I like this plant so much, it's the host plant for one of my favorite butterflies, the falcate orange tip. And it's a small little butterfly, a little bit smaller than a cabbage white. You know, it's only about yay big. And it only flies for a couple of weeks in the spring. But they're beautiful. The males have these orange tips to their wings. Females are totally white. And that host plant, the toothwort, is one of their host plants, as are any other plants in the mustard family. And so I have for years tried to find one of their chrysalises, and I'll show you why it was so difficult. And I was even having trouble finding caterpillars. Now, one of the hazards of being a naturalist is you quickly fall into all sorts of nature nerdiness. And caterpillars are one of my nature nerd problems. I love caterpillars. I find them endlessly fascinating. So I was looking for the caterpillars of these guys, and turns out they have some behavioral traits that make them very difficult to find. They tend to hide in a leaf litter most of the day and come out at night to feed. But I watched these guys lay eggs last year on one of the little yard weeds that I have, bittercress, which is in the mustard family. And after watching them, the females have a typical lilty flight when they're searching for a plant to lay eggs on. And I watched her lay an egg. It's pretty tiny. And then I collected some of these plants that had eggs in them. I actually dug them up and potted them and brought them inside so I could watch the life cycle. And here was one of the caterpillars, the larva. And indeed, they tended to feed mainly at night, or, you know, they were pretty cryptic, hard to find. But I kept it, and I think it took several weeks, which is a little unusual. Most caterpillars transform in 2 weeks. But this one started changing color, which is usually an indication that they're going to pupate. And then they attach themselves with silk. So you see the silk girdle right here. They make these funny motions like this with their head. The silk glands are right here under their chin, if you will, and they make a loop of silk, and then they slip their head under it, and they form this kind of C position, and that's known as the pre-pupa. And there's changes happening inside the caterpillar body at that point. And they remain like that for about 24 hours. And then they tend to straighten out a little bit. So as I was watching it, I knew when to start taking pictures again of the transformation process. And the skin splits on the back one last time, and the caterpillar skin is shed, and what is underneath it is the chrysalis. So here's the chrysalis, and it's believed to be a thorn mimic. So they form this chrysalis on nearby trees or twigs to where they were feeding on the host plants. So I have looked and looked and looked and never been able to find one of these things in nature, but here's an eraser, pencil eraser for scale. So you can see it's kind of a tiny little chrysalis. And then here's a picture of one on a twig from, you know, a little bit further back. And there it is right there. But this is a tulip poplar twig, which has this weird thing from the seeds the year before. And boy, that would be a hard thing to find out in the natural world. So it's a very effective camouflage. Turns out they may stay in this chrysalis for up to 2 years. So right now I have 4 of these things on my back porch, getting the cool temperatures and humidity. I saw my first falcate orange-tip butterfly flying on Tuesday of this week. So, you know, any day now they could come out, or I may be babysitting them for another year and wait till next spring. So another thing that's a sure sign of spring are these tent caterpillars hatching. This egg mass is laid on twigs of wild cherry trees, primarily in our area, last year, and they overwinter, and about now they're going to start hatching out, and there may be a couple of hundred tent caterpillars in one of these egg masses, and they form that, you've probably seen these before, and it, you know, you may be like my father-in-law was, he hated these things. And he always used to try, it was in an ornamental cherry that he had, and they are leaf defoliators. They will eat a lot of the leaves off of a tree, especially if you have 2 or 3 nests in your tree, but it doesn't usually kill the tree. It's just an eyesore, I guess. And so he had read where you could take a rag or flaming rag and set the thing on fire. And I definitely don't recommend that. He actually set his favorite tree on fire doing that. So don't do that. And I find them endlessly fascinating. They build these silken web nests, and it turns out they orient the largest, it's kind of an irregular shaped nest, and the largest panel of the nest is oriented so that it acts as a solar panel and heats up the inside of the nest and actually increases their growth rate. And 3 times a day, they come out of the nest and crawl up to branches to feed. And then when they return, they leave a silk trail, and that silk trail has chemical cues in it for the other caterpillars to follow. So you'll see long lines of these caterpillars going up and feeding on leaves and then coming back. And it's pretty, you can actually set your clock by it. It's like 3 times a day, mid-morning, a little around lunchtime, and then mid-afternoon. And a more effective thing, if you do have them and they're damaging one of your favorite trees, is just to poke some holes in it, in that webbing. And that allows wasps, yellow jackets, and birds access to the nest to feed on. Here's kind of, this was a patch of them on one of my cherry trees last year. They're actually quite colorful. They're sort of hairy caterpillars, which makes them somewhat unpalatable to a lot of birds. But even if you don't eat them, there's another thing that some birds use. So I was watching, and I think I spoke about this species at my last talk at your facility, the blue-gray gnatcatcher, a tiny little bird. It looks like a miniature mockingbird, sort of, and they should be arriving any day now from their Central American winter homes. But they use silk, both in spider webs and in the webs of tent caterpillars, as part of their nest construction. So I was fortunate enough to have one just off our back porch last year, and we got to watch this pair of gnat catchers come in every day, 4 or 5 times a day. They would take a chunk of the silk and fly back to their nest. And here's a picture of one of their nests. You can see the silk on the bill there of the caterpillar, and they use that to kind of stick together their nest, which is made of lichens and plant fibers. It looks very much like a hummingbird nest, except a little bit larger. And they're the only 2 birds that I know that regularly use this type of nest construction. I was privileged to watch these guys. They had 4 babies, and they were great parents. They fed them, and they would even chase away larger birds like crows even, which kind of surprises me considering these are relatively small birds. But as I indicated, most songbirds really rely on insects and spiders to feed their young. Even if they're seed eaters as adults, they feed their young protein-rich insects and spiders. And caterpillars are an especially important. So, that's one of the reasons I think I love caterpillars. I also love birds, and I realize how important caterpillars are to feed young birds. And so I've enjoyed over the years watching them, and I've posted several pictures on my blog. And a gentleman named Doug Tallamy, who's a scientist in Delaware, found some of those pictures and asked to use them. He has written several books. This was one of his first, called Bringing Nature Home. And he actually writes about the importance of planting native plants in your yards or landscapes, plants that grow there naturally, as an important way to support native animal communities, especially birds. And so some of his graduate students have actually compared yards in the Washington, D.C. area that had primarily native plants in them versus those that had mainly non-native ornamental plants in them. And they had some fascinating results from their study. Their study showed that native plants had about 4 times the insects, plant-eating insect biomass, and over 3 times as many different kinds of species, but remarkably, 35 times more caterpillar biomass. And so they've also then gone to show that the birds that nested in those yards that had more native plants actually were more successful in raising their young. And so here's a Carolina chickadee nest from a few years ago out of a nest box. They nest in hollow trees or nest boxes. One thing to note is all the hair in this nest. This is when I had a golden retriever, and chickadees usually use hair from animals in their nest, and they actually would come and pluck the hair out of my sleeping dog on the deck, which always startled the dog, of course. But Doug actually asked me to film some video of chickadees bringing food to their nests for a video that he and a woman scientist put together on creating important habitat for birds. So I was able to just sit up and watch these birds bringing their food to their nest. I had to put this when I first started it, they would just fly directly in the hole, and it was next to impossible to get a good picture of what they were bringing in. So I put this little piece of dowel on top so that they would land, perch for a second, and then fly into the hole. And while I was doing it, I said, I should start taking some notes. So here's what, for 1 hour one day while I was standing there, I counted how many times one of the parent birds brought food to the nest, and it was 21 trips in 1 hour. They brought 6 caterpillars. Over time, I noticed that they were feeding their nestlings about 12 hours a day. So I did the math. The young birds hatched and fledged, left the nest in 17 days. So 6 caterpillars in an hour times 12 times 17, that was 1,200 roughly caterpillars that these 2 chickadees fed to their young. Interestingly, they actually fed more spiders than they did caterpillars to their young. So that's a lot of insects and spiders that are required just to feed, one family of these birds, but they all fledged, and it was quite successful. Now, another thing about spring that I enjoy is this sort of a time of changing of the guard. Right now, we have all the winter birds at our feeders and in our yards, but very soon they're going to start leaving, which is, a little bit of sadness to that. Some of these guys I really enjoy looking at. The juncos, or what my dad used to call the snowbirds, they'll be leaving fairly soon. I still have a few in the yard eating seeds. Hermit thrushes, which come here and feed on berries in the winter, like this holly berry. They'll be leaving any day now. I did see one just the other day, so they're still around. Purple finches and pine siskins, which are birds that we don't get every winter here. They come mainly from the far north, but this year has been what they call an eruptive year, where seed crops were poor in the Canadian boreal forests. And so we were flooded this year with purple finches and pine siskins. And most of my pine siskins have already left. At times, I had over 50 at a time on the ground underneath my feeders. But they've all left, but I still have some purple finches. But the thing that really got to me this year that was such a pleasant surprise, for the first time since 1998, we had evening grosbeaks here in the Piedmont of North Carolina, at least first time in Chatham County where I am. So I was thrilled. These beautiful gregarious birds flock to my feeders. They do increase my seed budget quite a bit because they're 30 or 40 at a time, descend on the feeders, and they're quite raucous when they come down. They kind of squabble with one another, and they chase most of the other birds away, but they are still here. Every morning, they're coming to my feeders. I anticipate that any day now, though, they're going to return back to their Canadian forests where they breed. But has been a delight to have them again this year. I hope you got to see them if you have feeders set out. And then one of my other favorite winter-only birds for this part of North Carolina leaves these telltale signs, and I bet some of you know what these holes in a tree are from. And it's one of my favorite names for a bird, the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And they're here only in the winter, and they're a woodpecker that has special adaptations and a special diet where they drill holes in a tree in lines like that. And by the time they get over here to this one, they go back here because the sap has started flowing in that first hole they dug. And they learn that certain trees are much better at producing sap than others, so they keep coming time and time again. It looks like somebody hit it with a machine gun. But there's an interesting relationship that, because arriving soon, very soon, probably in the next week or two, are going to be the ruby-throated hummingbirds. And studies have shown males, this is a male, males arrive on their breeding grounds often before there are many flowers in bloom. So they will follow sapsuckers around, and they feed on the sap that flows out, plus the small insects that are attracted to the sap. So there's been a definitive relationship shown between hummingbirds and sapsuckers. And as I mentioned, this is a male, and these are two pictures of the same male, and he just tilted his head slightly, and you notice the difference in coloration. On the feathers here, they're very dark, and when he turned slight angle, they appear much more red, and those specialized feathers are called a gorget, the neck feathers. And instead of being pigmented like a red cardinal feather is pigmented, and it looks red no matter how you're looking at it, these feathers are like miniature prisms, if you will. And so they reflect sunlight differently depending on what angle they're facing the sun. So the birds have great control over that, and the males have this red gorget, and they can flash it to establish territory, drive off other males, or to attract females. So very nice thing to have if you're a male. The females then, as I mentioned when I talked about the blue-gray gnatcatcher, have these beautiful, delicate, tiny nests, and they incubate them, and they always lay 2 eggs, and they're about the size of a jelly bean. And then the 2 nestlings, this is right before they left the nest. They were actually practicing some when I was watching this particular nest. I had to stand on top of my car to get this picture at a neighbor's house, but I was thrilled to have the opportunity to actually watch baby hummingbirds. And the feeding mechanism, the female will come back with nectar, and it looks like she's going to choke them by sword swallowing act, but it's pretty dramatic. And they feed them a lot of tiny insects too, so fascinating. But as most of you know, they're attracted to particularly red flowers, and this is one of the favorites, cardinal flower. And you can actually see how the flower is so adapted to being pollinated by hummingbirds. Here's the the male part with the stamens. And as the hummingbird reaches in with its bill to the flower to get the nectar, it causes the male part to bend down and dust the head of the hummingbird with pollen, so that when it goes to the next flower, if the female part is receptive, it will actually transfer that pollen to the female part. So a few other of my favorites that are going to be showing up any day now. Usually it's about the first week of April when we hear the first melodious songs of wood thrushes in our woods. Sounds like a flute. Scarlet Taningers. We have both summer and Scarlet Taningers in our woods, and I just love these birds. They're so brilliant. And then the warblers, of course. We do have pine warblers that spend the winter with us, but most warblers migrate out of our area to Central and South America and will be returning soon. Actually, I've seen my first black and white warbler, first yellow-throated warbler so far, but the wave is coming in the next few weeks. Another of my favorite types of places to explore in spring are these seasonal pools. And they're seasonal in that they tend to dry up late in the summer and fill with rainwater. And that means they don't have fish in them, which is a critical thing for certain types of amphibians and insects. And so I'm going to go back to some rainy nights this February when it was cold and it's pouring pretty hard. And most of us are not thinking about romance. We're thinking about sitting by a fire and drinking a hot drink. But spotted salamanders, they have romance on their mind on those rainy nights in January and February. They migrate from their homes in woodland habitats in burrows, and they will migrate sometimes up to a half a mile or more to these vernal pools that don't have fish. And I actually have a couple of created water gardens in my yard, small ones, and then my neighbor has a larger one. And it was an amazing sight one rainy night. The harder it rains, the more the salamanders move, and there were probably 50 or more of these. And they're about this long, so 6-8 inches long. Most people have never seen them because the only time they're above ground for any length of time is during their migration to and from these vernal pools. And so they come into the pools, the males first, and they do this kind of writhing dance. And then the males will deposit what looks like bird droppings almost in the bottom of the pools, but it's actually a spermatophore. And you pick one up and it's this little gel cap that has sperm packets on the top. The female comes and picks it up in her cloaca, or one all-purpose opening. And then 2 nights later, she internally fertilizes her eggs, and then she will grasp a twig or some vegetation, ideally in a pool, and then lay the eggs. And the eggs come out in these gelatinous balls. Each black dot in there is an embryo. And each female can lay 4 or 5 of these, and they may have 50 to over 200 eggs in them. And right now in my pools, this is what the egg masses look like. They swell with water, so they get bigger. And if they're white, that particular embryo has died for some reason. Either a fungus got in it, or it might have gotten frozen if it was at the top of the water and we had a particularly hard night, or cold night. But in 4 to 6 weeks, they hatch, but they start developing and they get these weird little comma shapes. And then over time, you can actually see the young salamander developing in them. And they'll take on a greenish color. And it turns out that greenish color is very important to their survival. It's an algae. And the name of this algae is Oophila emblestomatis. The species name, or the genus, I guess, of the spotted salamanders is Ambelostoma. And Oophila means loves eggs. So it loves salamander eggs. This algae, the only place it's found in the world, is inside spotted salamander eggs, or so they thought. They have, in the past decade, also found it inside the adult female spotted salamanders. It's the only time there's been a mutual relationship shown between an algae and a vertebrate organism. But the relationship with the eggs has been known for over 100 years. And the algae get the nitrogen from the waste products of the developing salamander larvae, and the embryos, the actual salamander larvae, gets the oxygen produced by the algae. So it's a win-win situation. And just to show you, the big blob starts to break down, and the individual embryos start to separate out right before they hatch. And it takes 6 to 8 weeks, depending on temperature. Interesting, the little larvae, when they first came out, they can't navigate too well, and they have these fleshy little appendages on the sides of their head called balancers that after about 2 days are reabsorbed into the head once they have enough strength to actually swim and keep themselves upright. And here's a larvae. They have these large external gills to help them breathe. And then over the next couple of months during the summer, they'll reabsorb those gills and transfer into teenage metamorphs that then leave the pool and migrate into the woodlands and start the life cycle all over again. And these guys can live 15 to 20 years. So it's a really remarkable animal. Unfortunately, as we develop more areas, we tend to drain their habitats. And so it's increasingly rare to find them, although we do have a lot still in Chatham County where I live. Some of the other amphibians that are associated with these kind of pools, spring peepers, which have been calling now for a couple of weeks, tiny little frogs, about like that big with a mighty voice. And I love Thoreau's quote here, "Frogs are the birds of the night." Upland chorus frogs, I've also been hearing them, and they sound like somebody rubbing your thumb across a comb. And they've been calling quite a bit. And they get together, and the mating posture is called amplexus. It's an external fertilization. The male will release sperm as the female deposits her eggs into the water, and these guys have small egg clusters that develop into these cool little tadpoles. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it really well, but these are in a little aquaria, and this was some water from the pool, and that little thing right there is a copepod female with egg masses on it, on its appendages, and that is one of the primary food components or prey items of the salamander larvae that these guys shared their pool with. And here's one that's developing a little further. Another one that probably next month, American toads will start breeding, and they sound like spaceships off in the distance. They do that for 30 seconds, which I can't do. I'd make a terrible toad. And toad egg masses are strings, twisted strings of eggs instead of blobs, like some of the other frogs do. Cope's great tree frog, we have a lot of those in our woods, and there'll be a later spring one. They have these yellow flash points underneath their legs. And again, just a few eggs, and they'll breed in anything, a bucket, a dog dish, a bird bath. And here's the juvenile, just a beautiful little thing. Look at those eyes, absolutely incredible. And then as spring turns into summer, the two of our big frogs will start breeding. Bullfrogs, which, here's your frog lesson for the day. They have this ridge of skin that folds around their eardrum, this thing. And then they have huge tadpoles that live 2 to 3 years as tadpoles. And one of the ones that often gets mistaken for a bullfrog is the green frog. Doesn't get quite as big, but instead of the ridge just circling the eardrum, the ridge of folded skin goes down the length of their back. So that's how you can tell them apart. And their sound, by the way, a green frog is called a banjo frog. Sounds like that. And you can actually, here's your trivia point of the day for your next party. You can sex green frogs and bullfrogs by the relative size of their ears and eyes. Males have a large eardrum. It's a bigger diameter than the diameter of their eye. See that? And then females have an eardrum that's about the same size as the diameter of their eye. So there you go. Now you have something to talk about at the next party. So I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of scenes of some of the beautiful things that you might see in and around natural areas this time of year. And I think one of the things that I love about watching spring is that this quote here from Joe Northrop, it does have this common thread that I think all of us humans need, and that's a sense of place. And by paying attention to the changes in the season, it helps you connect more to the plants, the animals, the scene that is your landscape, and gives you that sense of place, which I think we all need, especially after a crazy year that we've had this past year. So here's just a few scenes of spring from my yard in Chatham County. These guys, chipmunks, are very busy right now. And I just love the fact that they can hold so much food in their cute little cheeks. Morel mushrooms will be popping up any day now in our woods. Baby mantises usually appear about the first week of April, so tiny, and there may be 200 or 300 in one mantis egg case. Galls, plant galls, and these are two particularly beautiful ones. Galls are formed by tiny wasps about the size of a gnat that lay eggs in a plant, and then the plant reacts and creates these structures. This is a particularly beautiful one called the wool sower's gall that occurs on white oak. And this one has multiple larvae of the wasp inside. Now, these wasps aren't harmful to humans at all, don't sting, but they have this relationship, special relationship with plants. One of my favorite trees is starting to show flower buds, the Pawpaw Tree, which produces North America's largest edible fruit, the pawpaw. And it's the host plant for zebra swallowtail butterflies. And these flowers have a slight stink to them and look like decaying meat and are pollinated by flies and beetles that are attracted to dead animals. So there's an interesting way to get your pollinators to come to you. I'm seeing our first annuals of the season already. Most of them are still brown in color because in cooler temperatures, they tend to be brown. As it warms up and as the breeding season gets on, they can change back and forth from brown to green, kind of a nice trick. My wild geraniums already have flower buds on them, one of the more delicate, beautiful wild flowers. And I can't wait for these guys to come back through. They don't nest here in our area, but they pass through every April. Rose-breasted grosbeak, and they nest in our mountains in North Carolina and further north, but they're an absolutely beautiful bird to have coming to your feeders. And then I was just looking this morning at our azaleas, our native azaleas, Pinkster azalea, and the buds are full and will burst probably in the next week and a half or so. And I just love this quote, you know, it's the earth is like a child that knows poems, and because it is spring again. So if you haven't already looked at my blog, I encourage you to do so. It's just my way of sharing my love of nature with people. Just go to Roads End Naturalist, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that anybody has. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen here in just a second. I'll let you look at that in case you want to get that information off of it. But so there we go. So
Thank you very much. Does anybody have a question they want to ask?
Hey, Mike, my name is Phil Baer, and we're starting a project here working with Nathan Summers, the Director of General Services. We have two areas on the campus. One is about 2.5 acres of, it's the headwaters for our little retention pond. The other is a wet spot of about 1 acre. We're going to have those cleared of all non-native invasive plants.
Awesome.
In 2 visits this summer. And I would love to have somebody like you come and give us some advice about what sorts of native plants we would be most successful trying to put in there. We're titling this project Restoration of the Understory.
Cool. That'd be great.
So
I'd be happy to do that.
I'll go to your website and give you contact information, and we can talk about it.
Yeah, that'd be great. In fact, I have good friends that, 2 friends that run native plant nurseries. Mellow Marsh Farms in Chatham County specializes in wetlands restoration. And then one of my neighbors, just a couple hundred yards down the road, is Cure Nursery, and they're another native plant nursery. Both, and I'm sure both of them would be happy to help. And you know, Mellow Marsh is used to doing huge projects, and so you can get plants very tiny from them at really good prices. So be happy to talk to you about that.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Great program today.
Well, thanks. That's a great project you all are doing. I'm glad you're doing it.
Do you have anybody else that has a question? You can write it in the chat box. You can unmute yourself or use the raise hand feature.
Am I unmuted?
Yes. Yeah, you are.
No, okay. I was going to ask, I heard last year that there is a large drop in the number of insects around. And I noticed during the summer that there didn't seem to be the number of insects that I'm used to seeing. And I was wondering whether you had heard about that sort of thing also.
Yeah, that was big news in the science world last year, and that was based on some studies. Well, at least some of it was based on some studies done in Europe, where they actually had an ingenious technique of putting aerial nets on vehicles, and they've been doing it for decades, and driving a specified route and catching all the bugs they could, and they noticed a huge drop recently. So, I think part of the issue is certainly there are a lot of concerns about native bees, for instance, because if you look, in fact, right now, Chatham County, we were kind of the last county in the triangle to be developed because we didn't have a central water and sewer system. But Chatham Park is a huge development coming into Pittsburgh that will, I think they have 7,000 acres. And so that's going to be a huge change. I think they're trying to do some good things in terms of planting some native species, but anytime you take that much native plant habitat out of circulation, that does have an impact on our native insects particularly. So I think, and that's Doug Tallamy's point, is he'd like to see every homeowner or anybody that manages land start planting species that are native to your area. And he firmly believes that we could turn that around. I haven't seen a dramatic change in my yard because it's all native stuff. And I don't use any pesticides in my yard. So, the monarch, I'm sure you're aware, monarch butterfly population has plummeted. That's been the most noticeable thing to me, because I tag monarch butterflies as part of the University of Kansas program every year, and I'm not seeing hardly any the past couple of years. So,
All right. Do we have any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Again, this will be shown on channel 1391 this upcoming week, and look for in the forest forward for that date and time. But thank you so much to Mike for presenting. It was very interesting. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And I look forward to seeing your project.